What if I told you that Prince Harry didn't lose his place in elite polo because of a bad game, but because of something far more explosive? Not a missed goal, not a public scandal caught on camera, but a series of whispers so serious that doors quietly slammed shut without a single announcement. And at the center of it all, a sentence that still circulates in hushed tones among California's most exclusive circles. Get a new wife. Now pause for a second. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. If that sentence was actually spoken, who would dare say it to a prince? And if it wasn't spoken, why does everyone act like it was? That's the question no one wants to answer publicly. But it's the question that explains everything that followed. Because this story isn't really about polo. It's about power. It's about reputation. And it's about what happens when you break rules that are never written down, but always enforced. Let's start here. For years, polo was supposed to be Prince Harry's safe haven, a sport tied to his past, a connection to his mother, a reminder of who he used to be before Hollywood, before lawsuits, before the endless headlines. When Harry arrived in California, polo looked like the perfect bridge between his old life and his new one. Sunlight instead of ceremony. Private fields instead of palace gates. Friends instead of courtiers. And at first, it seemed to work. He was welcomed, cautiously, but welcomed, into Santa Barbara's elite polo scene. Not because he was a prince, but because he understood the game. Or at least, that's what people thought. Because what many didn't realize at the time is that polo isn't just a sport. It's a culture, a hierarchy, a test. And most importantly, it's a world where horses are sacred. Not metaphorically, literally. In elite polo circles, horses aren't treated like animals. They're treated like partners. Assets worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Sometimes millions. You don't raise your voice around them. You don't rush them. You don't treat them like props in someone else's narrative. And you absolutely do not, under any circumstances, create drama around them. Because in polo, drama is tolerated, but disrespect is not. This is where the story begins to fracture. According to multiple insiders who have spoken quietly, never on record, tensions started building not on the field, but on the sidelines. Small things at first. A look held too long. A comment that didn't land right. A moment where the atmosphere shifted and people pretended not to notice. Have you ever been in a room where the temperature suddenly drops and no one explains why? That's how they describe it. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the conversations changed. Not out loud. Not in front of cameras, but in private texts, private dinners, private phone calls that stopped, including one particular name. Prince Harry. Now here's where it gets uncomfortable, because this is where allegations begin. And they must be treated carefully. No charges. No police reports. No official complaints. But allegations don't need paperwork to destroy reputations in elite circles. They only need belief. According to claims circulating within polo communities, concerns were raised about Meghan Markle's behavior around matches and horses. Not proven, not documented, but discussed. And in worlds like this, discussion is enough. Some insiders claim her presence changed the tone of events. Others say she asked questions that violated etiquette. A few allege confrontational moments that made longtime members uneasy. And then there's the most explosive claim of all. The one no one wants to say directly. Allegations involving the treatment of horses. Let's be very clear. There is no public evidence. No footage. No official findings. But within polo culture, even a whisper of mistreatment is nuclear. Why? Because these horses are everything. They are trained for years. They are monitored obsessively. They are protected by an unspoken code that outsiders rarely understand until it's too late. So when whispers began, whether fair or not, the response was swift. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just quiet distancing. And this is where one name keeps coming up. Nacho Figueras. To the public, Nacho is a model, an athlete, a friend of royalty. To polo insiders, he's something far more important. A gatekeeper. Nacho isn't just respected. He's trusted. And when someone like him stops returning calls, people notice. According to insiders, Nacho initially tried to smooth things over. Tried to explain cultural differences. Tried to keep the peace. But at some point, something shifted. And this is where the infamous sentence enters the story. Get a new wife. Did he say it? Some say yes. Some say it was paraphrased. Others say it symbolized a deeper message, not about marriage, but about risk. Because in elite circles, friendships aren't emotional. They're strategic. And protecting the sport comes before protecting people, especially famous ones. What we do know is this. After that period, Prince Harry's presence at Santa Barbara Polo events reportedly dropped off dramatically. Invitations slowed. Games stopped aligning with his schedule. Social overlap disappeared. No explanation was given. And that's the most brutal part. Because exile in elite worlds doesn't come with closure. It comes with silence. Ask yourself this: what's worse, being publicly banned or being quietly erased? Harry, by most accounts, didn't realize what was happening at first. He thought schedules had changed, that priorities had shifted, but then weeks turned into months, and the absence became undeniable. The man who once symbolized polo's modern revival in California was suddenly not there. And Meghan? According to claims, she was furious. Not embarrassed. Not apologetic. Furious. Because from her perspective, this wasn't about etiquette. It was about control. Hollywood power doesn't work the same way as polo power. Hollywood fights publicly. Polo punishes privately. And that clash, that misunderstanding, may have sealed everything. By the time anyone tried to address it openly, the verdict had already been delivered. No announcement. No statement. No second chance. Just closed gates. And here's the uncomfortable truth no one wants to say out loud. In elite circles, guilt doesn't matter as much as discomfort. If your presence creates unease, you're out. If your name sparks whispers, you're out. If your spouse becomes a liability, you're out. And whether fair or not, Prince Harry learned that lesson the hard way. But this was only the beginning. Because once polo turned its back, the consequences spread far beyond the field. And what came next would change everything, in ways no one saw coming. Have you ever wondered why some worlds don't explode when there's controversy? They simply close ranks. That's how elite polo works. Not with press releases. Not with confrontations. But with silence so deliberate it feels personal. And if you don't understand that culture, you never see the verdict coming. Because polo isn't just a sport. It's an ecosystem. A social order. A quiet test of whether you belong. And Prince Harry was about to learn that lesson the hard way. On the surface, polo looks glamorous. White pants, perfect grass, champagne on the sidelines, photographs that feel timeless. But behind that image is a ruthless hierarchy that hasn't changed in decades. This is a world built on lineage, trust, and something outsiders rarely grasp until it's too late: restraint. In elite polo circles, everything is measured. How you speak, how you move, how you react when something doesn't go your way, especially around the horses. Because here's the contradiction that confuses newcomers. Polo is aggressive, fast, physically demanding, yet the culture around it is almost reverent. The horses aren't just animals. They're investments, yes. But more than that, they're symbols of discipline and control. Lose your temper with a horse. You've already failed the test. And this is where the whispers begin to make sense. According to insiders, early unease didn't come from a single explosive incident. It came from a pattern. Moments where the mood shifted. Interactions that felt off. Not enough to cause a scene. Just enough to register. In polo culture, that's everything. Because people here don't confront you. They observe you. They watch how you handle pressure. They watch how you treat staff. They watch how you react when no one thinks it matters. And then, quietly, they decide. Prince Harry arrived believing familiarity would protect him. After all, polo wasn't new to him. It was part of his identity, part of his story. He wasn't some Hollywood outsider trying to buy credibility. He grew up with the sport. He understood the basics. But what he didn't fully grasp was this. California polo isn't British polo. And Santa Barbara isn't forgiving. In the UK, Royal Association cushions mistakes. In California's elite polo circles, celebrity amplifies them. Every action is scrutinized more closely, not less. And then there's the other reality no one prepares you for. In polo, spouses are part of the equation. Not officially, not on paper, but socially? Absolutely. Your partner represents you. Their behavior reflects your judgment. And this is where tension allegedly began to build. According to people who were present, Meghan Markle's presence on the sidelines drew attention immediately. Not because she was loud, not because she was dramatic, but because she didn't blend in. Now pause here. Blending in doesn't mean disappearing. It means respecting invisible boundaries, knowing when to speak, knowing when to stay silent, knowing when the event isn't about you. Hollywood culture rewards presence. Polo culture rewards restraint. And those two values collided. Some insiders claim Meghan asked questions others would never ask publicly. Questions about decisions, about pacing, about the horses themselves. Again, these are claims, not proven facts. But perception matters more than proof in elite spaces. Because once people start asking, why is she doing that? The clock starts ticking. One longtime member reportedly described it this way. It wasn't one thing. It was the feeling that she didn't respect the atmosphere. And in polo, atmosphere is sacred. Then came the rumors. Not shouted, not written, whispered. Conversations that started with, "Have you heard?" and ended with silence when someone new approached. These whispers weren't about scandal in the tabloid sense. They were about discomfort, about horses appearing agitated, about tension before matches, about moments that made people uneasy, even if they couldn't articulate why. And here's the brutal truth. In elite polo, unease equals danger. Because danger threatens reputation, and reputation is everything. Now, let's address the most explosive allegation carefully. There have been claims, and proven, undocumented, that concerns were raised about the treatment of horses around certain events. No specifics released, no public complaints filed, but even the suggestion was enough. Why? Because polo culture treats horses almost like family. You can fight with another player. You can argue over strategy. But if someone believes a horse is being mishandled, intentionally or not, that's a line you don't get to explain away. Insiders say that's when the tone changed completely. Suddenly, conversations weren't about schedules or matches. They were about risk. And risk is the one thing elite circles cannot tolerate. This is where gatekeepers step in. Not to punish, to protect. And one name keeps resurfacing at this exact moment. Nacho Figueras. To outsiders, Nacho is charismatic, stylish, friendly. To insiders, he's a stabilizer. Someone whose approval signals safety. Someone whose disapproval signals the opposite. According to people familiar with the situation, Nacho initially tried to downplay tensions. Cultural misunderstandings happen. Newcomers adjust. But something changed. The calls became less frequent. The reassurance faded. And then, silence. No confrontation. No explanation. Just distance. That's how polo handles problems. Because open conflict attracts attention. And attention attracts outsiders. Better to let the issue resolve itself through exclusion. And this is where Prince Harry reportedly misread the situation. He assumed time would fix things, that relationships would normalize. But in elite circles, time doesn't heal. It confirms. Weeks passed, then months. Harry's name stopped coming up in planning conversations. His availability stopped being checked. And the most devastating part? No one told him why. Imagine being slowly erased from a world you thought welcomed you. No argument to defend yourself against. No accusation to address. Just absence. According to insiders, this is when frustration turned to anger. Not from polo members, but from Meghan. Because from her perspective, this wasn't about etiquette or tradition. It was about disrespect. Hollywood operates on visibility, influence, leverage. If you feel slighted, you push back. Polo doesn't push back. It pulls away. And that misunderstanding widened the gap beyond repair. Some claim attempts were made to smooth things over. Private conversations, carefully worded messages. But once trust erodes in elite spaces, apologies don't restore it. They confirm the problem. By the time anyone realized how serious the situation was, the decision had already been made. Quietly, collectively. Prince Harry was no longer seen as worth the risk. Not because of one proven incident. Not because of a documented offense. But because discomfort had replaced confidence. And in polo, that's the final verdict. Here's the question no one asks out loud. Is that fair? Or is it simply how power protects itself? Elite circles don't operate on evidence. They operate on instinct. And once instinct turns against you, titles don't save you. Fame doesn't save you. Even friendship doesn't save you. Especially when the sport itself feels threatened. By the time Harry realized he wasn't just busy, he was excluded. The gates were already closed. And that silence? It wasn't accidental. It was intentional. Because in the sacred world of elite polo, exile isn't announced. It's enforced. And this was only the first door to close. Because once Polo withdrew its protection, the consequences didn't stay on the field. They followed Harry everywhere. And the next chapter reveals how that quiet exclusion turned into something far more damaging, a reputational chain reaction no one could stop. What happens when a prince walks into a room that doesn't care he's a prince? That's not a rhetorical question. It's the quiet experiment Santa Barbara Polo ran on Prince Harry the moment he arrived. Because here's the first contradiction no one warned him about. In Hollywood, status opens doors. In elite polo, status tests patience. Titles don't impress. They complicate. And from the very beginning, Harry's entry into California polo came with attention most people missed. On paper, it looked perfect. A seasoned player. A lifelong connection to the sport. A high-profile move that could bring visibility and sponsorships. But beneath that optimism was something colder. Caution. Because polo clubs like Santa Barbara aren't built for exposure. They're built for insulation. They don't want crowds. They don't want headlines. They don't want anyone who changes the balance. And a prince? A prince changes everything. At first, Harry was treated politely. Invited, but not embraced. Welcomed, but not woven in. People shook his hand, smiled, made small talk. But they watched. They watched how he handled losing a point. They watched how he spoke to grooms. They watched how he reacted when something went wrong. Because that's the real audition in elite polo. Not how you play, but how you behave when you don't get your way. Harry, by most accounts, tried to fit in. He dressed appropriately. He followed protocol on the field. He kept things low-key at first. But there was a problem no amount of effort could solve. He wasn't just Harry. He was Prince Harry. And that came with baggage California polo didn't ask for. Security concerns. Media interest. Curiosity from outsiders who had no business being there. Every time Harry showed up, the environment shifted slightly. Not dramatically, just enough to matter. Longtime members started adjusting routines. Staff became more alert. People spoke a little less freely. That might sound trivial, but in a world built on ease and familiarity, it's disruptive. And then came the second layer. Harry didn't arrive alone. He arrived with a partner whose presence commanded attention whether she wanted it to or not. Meghan Markle. Now let's slow this down, because this is where misunderstanding turns into friction. Polo spouses are expected to follow a specific rhythm. They observe. They support quietly. They socialize carefully. They don't influence the game. They don't question decisions. They don't center themselves in the experience. Again, not written rules, but unbreakable ones. According to people familiar with those early days, Meghan didn't violate rules outright. Instead, she challenged assumptions. She asked why things were done a certain way. She engaged directly with staff. She treated the environment more like an event than a ritual. In Hollywood, that's normal. In polo, it's unsettling. And here's the emotional contradiction insiders describe. Meghan wasn't rude. She was confident. But confidence, when it doesn't align with tradition, reads as threat. Some members reportedly felt she was trying to manage the atmosphere rather than adapt to it. Again, perception, not proof. But perception decides everything here. Harry, meanwhile, seemed caught between worlds. On one side, a culture that expected quiet conformity. On the other, a partner used to visibility and influence. And this is where stress began to show. Not in public outbursts. Not in viral moments. In micro-reactions. A tone change. A look of frustration. A conversation that ended too abruptly. Insiders say Harry became more tightly wound as time went on. Less relaxed. More defensive. Because he sensed something was off, but couldn't identify it. And that uncertainty is dangerous. Because when you don't know the rules you're breaking, you can't stop breaking them. The first real warning, according to sources, came quietly. A suggestion to arrive earlier. A reminder about spacing on the sidelines. A gentle comment about keeping things simple. In any other world, these would be nothing. In polo, they're red flags. But Harry reportedly didn't see them that way. Why would he? No one sat him down. No one explained the stakes. And polo never explains itself. It expects you to know. By mid-season, the dynamic had shifted noticeably. Harry was still playing. Still participating. But the warmth was gone. Invitations to private dinners became rare. Post-match gatherings shortened. Conversations stayed surface level. People were polite, but distant. And that distance sent a message Harry wasn't prepared to hear. You are welcome here, conditionally. Now here's where the story gets more complicated. Because some insiders argue Harry was held to an impossible standard. They claim no outsider, royal or not, could have navigated that transition perfectly. That polo culture is unforgiving by design. And they might be. And that distinction matters more than most people realize. When Meghan began attending matches regularly, the shift wasn't explosive. It was atmospheric. People noticed her immediately, not because she demanded attention, but because attention found her. That's the paradox of celebrity in closed circles. You can try to be discreet, but your presence still changes the geometry of the room. Some insiders say Meghan brought energy. Others say she brought friction. Both can be true. According to those familiar with the environment, her sideline behavior didn't violate any formal rules. But elite polo doesn't operate on formal rules. It operates on comfort. And comfort, once disturbed, is almost impossible to restore. Let's talk about what sideline etiquette really means in this world. You don't hover. You don't direct. You don't insert yourself into strategic moments. You observe, support, and blend. It sounds passive, but it's actually a show of respect. Because the game belongs to the players and the horses. Everyone else is a guest. Insiders claim Meghan didn't fully adopt that posture, not out of arrogance, but out of instinct. Hollywood trains you to engage, to participate, to shape outcomes. Polo trains you to step back, and that difference began to show in subtle ways. A question asked at the wrong time, a suggestion offered where silence was expected, a reaction that felt too visible. Again, not wrongdoing. But in elite circles, discomfort doesn't need justification. It only needs consensus. Some say Meghan's confidence read as control. Others say her interest read as interference. What's important is not which interpretation is correct, but that interpretation existed at all. Because once people start interpreting your presence, you're already in trouble. And here's the emotional contradiction that made things worse. Harry didn't see a problem. From his perspective, Meghan was supportive, engaged, interested in the sport that mattered to him. Why wouldn't she be involved? But polo doesn't reward involvement from the sidelines. It rewards invisibility. And this is where Harry's loyalty to his wife collided with polo's unspoken expectations. Every time someone raised a concern, softly, indirectly, Harry reportedly bristled. Not because he was aggressive, but because he felt misunderstood. And that defensiveness, insiders say, registered immediately. In elite spaces, defensiveness equals instability. It signals that boundaries aren't being absorbed. And boundaries are everything. Now let's address the most sensitive part carefully. There are allegations, again, allegations, that moments occurred involving the horses that unsettled people present. No specifics have been made public. No documentation has surfaced. But within polo culture, the mere suggestion is devastating. Because horses are not accessories. They're partners whose welfare defines the legitimacy of the sport. Insiders describe a moment, not dramatic, not violent, where the energy around a horse shifted and people noticed. A reaction that felt rushed. A tone that felt sharp. Nothing that would alarm an outsider. Everything that would alarm a polo insider. And here's the part that's hard to explain unless you've lived in elite circles. You don't accuse. You don't confront. You log it, mentally, and then you compare notes. And if multiple people feel the same unease, the response isn't outrage. It's withdrawal. That's when people begin to distance. Not from the person accused, but from the risk they represent. From that point on, Meghan's presence was no longer neutral. It became debated. Quietly. Some defended her. She's new. She's curious. She doesn't know the culture. Others were less forgiving. This isn't Hollywood. This isn't a photo op. This isn't negotiable. And Harry? He was caught in the middle, trying to normalize something polo culture had already labeled as abnormal. Insiders say he pushed back gently at first, tried to explain intentions, tried to smooth over discomfort. But smoothing over discomfort doesn't work in elite spaces. It amplifies it, because it signals that the message isn't being received. And then came the moment that changed everything. Not a fight, not a scandal, a silence. According to multiple accounts, there was a match where Meghan's presence triggered visible tension among long-standing members. People who never commented. Not publicly, privately. And once those conversations start, they don't stop. Because now it's not about behavior. It's about judgment. Do we trust their judgment? Do we trust their restraint? Do we trust that this won't escalate? And when the answer isn't an immediate yes, elite circles do what they always do. They close ranks. From that point on, the atmosphere shifted decisively. Meghan wasn't shunned outright. She wasn't confronted. She was managed, positioned farther away, included less, surrounded by fewer familiar faces. And Harry noticed. But instead of interpreting it as a warning, insiders say he interpreted it as hostility, which made him more protective, more present, more visibly aligned with his wife. And that alignment, while emotionally understandable, sealed their fate socially. Because polo culture expects separation of roles. Players play, spouses support quietly. When those roles blur, discomfort turns into rejection. And rejection in elite circles is never dramatic. It's procedural. Invitations stop arriving. Schedules change. Overlaps vanish. And here's the cruel irony. The more Harry and Meghan sensed exclusion, the more visible they became, trying to reclaim space, trying to reassert belonging, which only confirmed the perception that they didn't understand the culture they were trying to join. This is where resentment quietly took root. Not anger. Resentment. From people who felt the environment they had protected for decades was being reshaped without their consent. From people who felt forced to choose between tradition and accommodation. And in polo, tradition always wins. By the time anyone considered having an honest conversation, it was already too late. Because elite circles don't debate outcomes. They enact them. And somewhere in that quiet consensus, a decision was made. This situation is too risky. Not because of proof. Not because of certainty. But because of discomfort. And in worlds built on discretion, discomfort is fatal. Harry and Meghan didn't realize it yet, but the sidelines had already delivered their verdict. The field would soon follow. And the person who would make that verdict irreversible wasn't a committee. It was one man. A gatekeeper whose silence spoke louder than any accusation. And when he finally stopped answering calls, the message was unmistakable. The door wasn't just closing. It was closed. And in the next chapter, we'll examine that relationship, how it formed, how it fractured, and why one sentence, whether spoken or not, became the symbol of total exile. What if the most damaging moment wasn't loud, but quiet enough that only insiders noticed? Because that's how this part of the story unfolds. No headlines, no viral clips, no dramatic confrontation, just a collective pause, the kind that tells you something important has just happened, even if no one explains it. In elite polo, that pause is everything. Let's slow this down, because this is the most misunderstood and most explosive chapter of the entire saga. And it has to be handled carefully. There are no official reports, no public accusations, no confirmed incidents. What exists are allegations, concerns, whispers that traveled through private conversations rather than public platforms. But in this world, whispers don't stay small. They metastasize. Here's what people outside polo don't fully grasp. Horses are not treated as animals you manage. They are treated as partners you listen to. Their temperament is monitored constantly. Their stress levels are watched. Their reactions are read like a language. And everyone around them is expected to do the same. So when insiders describe moments where a horse appeared unsettled, not injured, not harmed, but unsettled, alarms go off. Not because of what definitely happened, but because of what might have happened. According to people familiar with the situation, concerns arose around how certain moments were handled when tension spiked. Not shouting, not violence, energy, tone, urgency where calm was expected. To an outsider, it might look like nothing. To a polo insider, it's a breach. Because in this sport, emotional regulation is non-negotiable. Lose your temper with a teammate? Unprofessional, but survivable. Lose your composure around a horse. That's existential. And here's where the story becomes dangerous. Because once someone believes a horse may have been mishandled, even unintentionally, the conversation changes instantly. It stops being about personality. It becomes about ethics. And ethics, once questioned, don't get the benefit of the doubt. Insiders describe a particular match where several people independently noticed the same thing. Not an act, a reaction. A moment where the atmosphere tightened and eyes followed a horse rather than the play. Again, no footage, no documentation, But multiple people felt the same discomfort. And in elite circles, shared discomfort becomes truth. Now ask yourself this. How do you confront someone powerful about something you can't prove? You don't. You protect the environment instead. You quietly ensure the situation doesn't repeat. And that's exactly what insiders say began to happen. Schedules were adjusted. Access narrowed. Oversight increased. Not officially, subtly. And here's the contradiction that made it worse. From the outside, nothing appeared wrong. Photos still circulated. Matches still happened. But beneath that surface, trust was eroding. And trust is the currency of elite sport. Some insiders say the concerns were exaggerated. Others say they were understated. What matters is that they existed. And once they did, they couldn't be erased. Because polo culture doesn't debate allegations involving horses. It acts to prevent risk. And this is where Harry found himself trapped. He wasn't accused. He wasn't confronted. But he was associated. Associated with a narrative that had begun to circulate without his participation. And that's the cruelest part of elite world consequences. You don't get a chance to defend yourself. Because defense implies conflict. And conflict implies publicity. And publicity is the one thing polo avoids at all costs. So instead of accusations, there was distancing. Instead of explanation, there was silence. And silence is never neutral. Silence communicates judgment. Now let's address the word that keeps being used carefully, alleged. Why does that matter? Because allegations don't need to be true to be powerful. They only need to be believed by the people who control access. And access is everything here. According to insiders, once the horse concerns were raised, even indirectly, the discussion shifted toward containment. How do we ensure this doesn't happen again? How do we minimize exposure? How do we protect the horses, the sport, and the club? Those questions didn't include, how do we clear this up? Because clearing things up requires openness. And openness invites outsiders. Elite polo chooses protection every time. Harry, meanwhile, reportedly sensed the change but didn't understand its cause. He wasn't told about the whispers. He wasn't informed of the concerns. So from his perspective, the coldness felt arbitrary, unfair, personal, which led to frustration. And frustration, when visible, only validates insider fears. Because elite spaces equate emotional volatility with risk. And risk is the one thing they won't tolerate. Some people close to the situation say Harry tried to push back. Not aggressively, but with confusion. Why are things different? Why is access changing? Why does it feel like we're being sidelined? And that questioning, while human, was interpreted as pressure. Pressure invites scrutiny. Scrutiny amplifies concern. And concern accelerates exclusion. Now here's where the narrative becomes almost impossible to stop. Once the horse issue entered the conversation, everything else was reinterpreted through that lens. Past moments were re-examined. Minor tensions were recontextualized. Neutral interactions were reassessed. This is how reputational collapse works in elite circles. Not through one catastrophic event, but through accumulation. And the worst part? Harry and Meghan weren't fully aware of what they were being accused of, because no one accused them directly. They were being judged in rooms they weren't invited into. That's how power protects itself, by deciding outcomes without participation. By the time the couple sensed that something serious was wrong, the narrative had already hardened. Not publicly, internally. And internal narratives don't need proof. They need alignment. People close to polo culture describe it this way. Once someone believes a horse may have been mistreated, even emotionally, that person is radioactive. Not evil, not malicious, just unsafe. And safety is the highest value in this world. So what do you do with someone you believe might be unsafe? You remove them from the environment. Quietly, without spectacle. And that's exactly what began to happen. Harry's participation became limited. Access became conditional. Inclusion became selective. And Meghan's presence, already debated, became untenable. Not because of evidence, but because of association. Because once a spouse becomes linked to a risk narrative, the couple becomes inseparable in judgment. And here's the emotional twist no one talks about. Harry didn't just feel excluded. He felt humiliated. Because from his perspective, nothing had happened. No wrongdoing. No explanation. Just rejection. And rejection, without explanation, breeds resentment. Resentment leads to defensiveness. Defensiveness confirms suspicion. It's a closed loop. And the more Harry and Meghan felt misunderstood, the more they leaned on each other, which, ironically, made them look less adaptable, less flexible, less willing to absorb unspoken rules. And that perception, fair or not, sealed their fate. By the time anyone considered addressing the allegations head-on, the cost of doing so felt too high, too risky, too visible. Better to let the situation resolve itself. And resolve itself, in elite circles, means disappearance. This chapter is uncomfortable because it forces a hard question. Is it fair to judge people based on allegations never proven? Or is that simply how elite worlds survive? Polo doesn't operate like courts of law. It operates like ecosystems. Anything that threatens balance is removed, regardless of intent, regardless of explanation. By the end of this phase, one thing was clear. This wasn't about one moment anymore. It was about trust. And trust, once fractured around horses, is never repaired. Because you can forgive people, but you don't gamble with animals you're sworn to protect. And this is where the final lever was pulled. The lever that would make the exclusion permanent. The lever controlled by a man whose approval once opened every door. And in the next chapter, we're going to look at how that approval turned into silence, and why silence, in this case, was louder than any condemnation. What happens when the one person who could protect you stops picking up the phone? That's not a metaphor. That's the moment this story crossed the point of no return. Because until then, everything that had happened could still be explained away. Misunderstandings, cultural clashes, unfortunate timing. But when the gatekeeper goes silent, the message is unmistakable. And in this world, silence is never accidental. Let's talk about why this mattered so much. In elite polo, there are players, and then there are anchors. Anchors are the people everyone trusts to stabilize the room. They smooth tensions. They vouch for newcomers. They quietly decide who is safe to bring in and who is not. Harry believed he had one of those anchors. A friend. A bridge. Someone who understood both worlds. And for a long time, that belief wasn't wrong. The friendship between Harry and Nacho had real history. Shared matches. Shared moments. Shared understanding of what polo meant to both of them. Harry wasn't just another player to him. He was someone he'd stood beside on the field. Which is why what happened next hit so hard. Because the shift wasn't dramatic. There was no argument. No fallout. No raised voices. Just distance. Calls that went unanswered. Messages that took longer to reply. Plans that never quite materialized. At first, Harry reportedly brushed it off. People get busy. Schedules change. Life happens. But in elite circles, patterns matter more than excuses. And the pattern was clear. The person who once smoothed everything over had stopped smoothing. That's when insiders say Harry started to worry. Because he understood something most outsiders don't. In polo, you don't need everyone on your side. You need the right person on your side. And when that person steps back, everyone else follows. Now here's the part that complicates the narrative. According to people close to the situation, Nacho didn't cut Harry off out of cruelty. He didn't do it to punish. He did it to protect. Protect the sport. Protect the horses. Protect the fragile balance that keeps elite polo functioning. Because once the horse concerns entered the conversation, the stakes changed. Friendship became secondary. Reputation became collective. And the role of an anchor is to choose the ecosystem over the individual, even when it hurts. Insiders say Nacho found himself in an impossible position. On one hand, loyalty to a friend. On the other, responsibility to a culture that had trusted him for decades. And in polo, trust isn't emotional. It's existential. If people believe you'll protect the wrong thing, you lose your influence. And losing influence in elite circles is permanent. So the decision, whether conscious or instinctive, was to step back, to remove himself from the equation. Because as long as he was publicly close to Harry, the controversy couldn't be contained. And containment had become the priority. Here's the uncomfortable truth. When elite circles feel threatened, they don't look for explanations. They look for exits. And stepping back was the cleanest exit available. Now let's talk about the sentence that became legend. Get a new wife. Was it said exactly like that? No one can agree. Some claim it was said privately. Some say it was paraphrased. Others insist it was never spoken, only implied. But here's what matters. Everyone understood the message. This isn't about marriage. It's about risk. It was shorthand for something much colder. Your personal choices are endangering your professional standing. In elite circles, partners aren't private. They're extensions. And once a partner becomes associated with instability, the individual becomes radioactive. That's not judgment. That's strategy. People close to polo culture describe this as a fork in the road moment. Stay publicly loyal and lose influence. Step back and preserve the ecosystem. There was no third option. And when Nacho stepped back, others took notice. Because his behavior signaled permission. Permission to distance. Permission to disengage. Permission to let the exclusion finalize itself. Harry wanted understanding. Meghan wanted accountability. Polo offered neither. Because polo doesn't argue with narratives. It eliminates them. And by stepping back, the gatekeeper ensured the narrative would resolve itself without noise. Here's the contradiction that makes this story so uncomfortable. Nacho didn't have to say anything to end Harry's polo chapter. He just had to stop preventing it from ending. That's power. And power in elite circles is exercised quietly. Once his support was no longer visible, the machinery moved fast. Invitations disappeared. Schedules filled without Harry's name. Social overlap collapsed. And because there was no formal break, there was no path to repair. No apology could be directed. No misunderstanding clarified. Because no one would confirm there was a problem. This is how elite worlds avoid scandal. They turn people into ghosts. You're not banned. You're not criticized. You're just gone. Harry's absence became normalized. People adjusted quickly. That's another brutal truth. Elite circles don't mourn. They adapt. And once adaptation happens, reversal is nearly impossible. By the time Harry realized the silence wasn't temporary, it was permanent. The gatekeeper wasn't coming back. And without that protection, every door remained closed. This chapter matters because it reveals something most people never see. Exile doesn't begin with accusations. It begins with silence from the one person who used to make everything okay. And when that silence arrives, it's already over. But here's where the story takes an even darker turn. Because once polo cut ties, the consequences didn't stay contained. The silence spread. The reputational damage expanded beyond the field. And suddenly, Harry wasn't just losing polo. He was losing access. Access to social circles. Access to credibility. Access to the one space that still connected him to who he used to be. And in the next chapter, we'll examine how that quiet exclusion transformed into full social exile. How Harry didn't just lose a sport, but an entire world that had once claimed him. Because once you're cut off at the top, everything below collapses faster than you expect. What if 4 words, never recorded, never confirmed, were powerful enough to end an entire chapter of someone's life? Get a new wife. Even if you believe those words were never spoken exactly like that, ask yourself something more important. Why did everyone act as if they were? Because in elite circles, language isn't always literal. Sometimes it's symbolic. Sometimes it's shorthand. And sometimes, a phrase becomes a vessel for a truth people are too careful to say outright. By the time this sentence began circulating, quietly, informally, never on the record, the damage was already done. It didn't create the rupture. It explained it. Up until this point, Harry could still tell himself a story. That things were awkward, but fixable. That misunderstandings would clear. That friendships would reassert themselves. But once that phrase entered the orbit, even as rumor, it reframed everything. Because now the exclusion had a narrative. And narratives are dangerous, especially when they travel faster than facts. Let's break down why those 4 words mattered so much. In elite spaces, no one tells you directly that you're a liability. They tell you indirectly. Through absence. Through silence. Through symbolic phrases that communicate risk without accusation. Get a new wife was never really about marriage. It was about alignment. It meant your personal life has crossed into professional consequence. And once that line is crossed, elite cultures don't negotiate. They retreat. Some insiders insist the phrase was never said verbatim. They argue it was a paraphrase, something softer, less brutal, later condensed into something sharper. Others claim it was said privately, offhand, almost as a warning rather than an insult. And a third group says it doesn't matter either way, because the behavior that followed made the meaning unmistakable. Let's be honest about something uncomfortable. If this were purely rumor, it would have faded. Elite circles are full of gossip. Most of it evaporates. This didn't. It stuck. Why? Because it aligned with behavior people were already seeing. Distance. Withdrawal. A sudden unwillingness to be associated. That's how rumors gain credibility, by matching observable outcomes. And from that moment on, Harry's situation changed fundamentally. He wasn't just excluded. He was explained away. People who asked why he wasn't around anymore didn't get details. They got a look, a pause, a vague explanation about fit, and sometimes, depending on the room, a version of that phrase. Not repeated loudly, not quoted, but referenced, as if everyone already understood. That's when Harry reportedly realized something was deeply wrong. Because this wasn't social drift. This was coordinated disengagement. He wasn't being forgotten. He was being removed. Now imagine what that realization feels like. You're a public figure accustomed to conflict playing out loudly. You're used to statements, rebuttals, narratives. But here, there's nothing to respond to. No accusation. No document. No confrontation. Just the sense that a decision has been made without you. And that decision isn't reversible. According to people familiar with Harry's mindset at the time, this was devastating. Not just emotionally. Identity-wise. Polo wasn't just a hobby. It was one of the last spaces where he wasn't the Duke or the headline. It was where he felt competent, grounded, connected to something older than the chaos of his recent life. And now that space was rejecting him. Not because of performance, but because of proximity, because of association. That's a hard thing to process, especially when you don't believe the association is fair. Harry reportedly asked questions, not demands, not ultimatums. Questions. What happened? Why has everything changed? Is there something we need to address? And those questions were met with something worse than disagreement. They were met with deflection. People changed the subject, blamed schedules, referenced complications. Complications is an elite world euphemism. It means, we don't want to say this out loud. And the more Harry pushed for clarity, the more people retreated. Because clarity would require someone to say the quiet part. And no one wanted to be that person. Here's where the situation crossed from painful to irreversible. Once Harry became aware of the rumored phrase, he couldn't unhear it. Every interaction was filtered through it. Every silence felt like confirmation. And the emotional toll of that kind of ambiguity is immense. Because you don't know what to fix. You don't know what to apologize for. You don't know if fixing it is even possible. Now let's talk about Meghan's reaction, as described by those close to the situation. If Harry internalized the silence, Meghan externalized it. From her perspective, this wasn't about tradition or etiquette. It was about exclusionary power. She reportedly saw the phrase, real or imagined, as emblematic of a system that punishes women by proxy, that blames wives for discomfort rather than addressing issues directly. And whether you agree with that interpretation or not, it shaped how the couple responded. Instead of retreating further, they became more united, more visible as a pair, more resistant to being quietly sidelined, which, ironically, only reinforced the elite perception that boundaries weren't being respected. This is the tragic loop of elite exclusion. The more you try to assert your place, the more you confirm you don't belong. Because belonging in these circles is demonstrated by restraint, not insistence. By silence, not argument. And once that loop starts, it rarely ends well. At this point, the phrase had done its job. It had crystallized sentiment. It had simplified a complex situation into a single takeaway. And in elite worlds, simple takeaways spread faster than nuanced truths. Harry was now viewed not as someone caught in a misunderstanding, but as someone whose personal life posed ongoing risk. And risk is the one thing elite ecosystems eliminate ruthlessly. This wasn't about cruelty. It was about preservation. Preserving tradition. Preserving discretion. Preserving the illusion of harmony. And that illusion mattered more than fairness. By the time Harry fully grasped the permanence of the shift, the doors were no longer just closed. They were sealed. No invitations. No callbacks. No casual run-ins. People adjusted as if he had never been part of the ecosystem at all. That's the final stage of elite exile. Normalization. When absence stops being noticed. And that normalization cut deeper than any insult could, because it meant the community had already moved on. The phrase, spoken or not, became a footnote. The outcome became the story. And Harry was left standing outside a world that had once felt like refuge, wondering how something so informal had become so final. But here's the part most people miss. This wasn't the end of the consequences. It was the beginning of their spread. Because elite circles overlap. Polo connects to philanthropy. Philanthropy connects to donors. Donors connect to boards. And once a narrative of risk attaches to a name, it travels. Quietly, efficiently, relentlessly. In the next chapter, we're going to follow that ripple effect. How exclusion from a polo club turned into something much larger. How social distancing became reputational isolation. And how Harry's loss of one world triggered the collapse of several others, almost overnight. Because in elite ecosystems, nothing exists in isolation. And once you're labeled a problem in one room, every other room hears about it. What's more devastating than being told you're not welcome? Never being told at all. That's how the exile unfolded. No announcement. No confrontation. No dramatic moment where someone stood up and drew a line. Just a quiet, methodical retreat that felt almost polite. And that's what made it lethal. Because in elite circles, politeness is how decisions hide. At first, the changes were small enough to explain away. A match date that suddenly conflicted. A practice session that filled up faster than usual. A casual gathering that just happened without them. Nothing that screamed rejection. Everything that whispered it. People close to the scene described this phase as the most psychologically brutal. Because it toys with your instincts. You keep asking yourself, am I imagining this? Did I miss an email? Is everyone just busy? And while you're asking those questions, the machine keeps moving. The place at the center of it all was Santa Barbara Polo and Racket Club. On paper, nothing changed. Harry wasn't banned. His name wasn't removed from lists. No rules were rewritten. But access isn't about paper. It's about momentum. And his momentum slowed to a crawl. Insiders say the first unmistakable sign came when post-match routines shifted. Polo isn't just about what happens on the field. It's about what happens after. The drinks. The debriefs. The relaxed conversations where bonds form and trust is reinforced. Those moments started evaporating. Someone would suggest a quick wrap-up. Another would leave early. A third would say they had another commitment. All reasonable. All coordinated. Harry noticed. He felt the temperature change. And once you feel it, you can't unfeel it. According to those familiar with his mindset at the time, he tried to adapt. Arrived earlier. Kept things lighter. Pulled back on interaction. But adaptation only works if the door is still open. Here it wasn't. Because the decision had already been made. And elite decisions, once made, don't reverse themselves through effort. They solidify. Another sign came through scheduling. Matches Harry expected to be invited to were suddenly full. Not officially. Just unfortunately. Practice slots disappeared. Teams reconfigured. Not dramatically. Just enough that his inclusion became inconvenient. That's how exclusion works when it wants to avoid drama. It creates friction. Enough friction that you eventually stop trying. And then something more telling happened. The social overlap collapsed. People Harry used to see casually began appearing only in controlled contexts. A quick wave. A polite smile. No conversation. It's hard to explain how loud that silence is unless you've lived it. Because these aren't strangers. These are people who once joked with you, shared drinks with you, asked about your life. Now they were treating you like a professional acquaintance. That shift is intentional. It communicates, we see you, but we're not engaging. And that message stings. Harry reportedly oscillated between confusion and frustration. From his perspective, nothing concrete had happened. No rules broken. No warnings issued. So why was he being treated like a liability? The answer, of course, is that liability doesn't need proof. It needs perception. And perception had turned. Here's where the process becomes almost surgical. Elite circles don't push people out directly. They remove incentives to stay. You're not rejected. You're made uncomfortable, uncertain, out of sync. And eventually, you opt out. That way, the narrative becomes, he stopped coming. Not, we stopped inviting him. Insiders say this is exactly what was happening. Harry was being edged towards self-removal. And the club could plausibly deny any wrongdoing. After all, nothing had been said. Nothing had been done. And that's the genius of it. Because when you finally step back, it looks voluntary. But here's the contradiction. Harry didn't step back. Not immediately. He kept showing up. Which made the situation awkward. Because the mechanism assumes compliance. When someone refuses to quietly disappear, the pressure increases. More distancing, more avoidance, more excuses. And with each interaction, the message becomes clearer. You are not wanted here. But no one will say it. That's when resentment started to build. Not just in Harry, in the community. Because now the situation felt unresolved. And unresolved tension is something elite spaces hate. They prefer clean breaks. So the distancing intensified. Not cruelly, systematically. Insiders describe a moment when Harry arrived expecting to play and realized, too late, that arrangements had shifted without him. No malice, just a mission, a team already formed, a schedule already set, and he was standing there, out of place. That's a humiliation that doesn't need words, because everyone can see it, and everyone pretends not to. That's when it hit him. This wasn't temporary. This wasn't awkwardness. This was exile. Slow, polite, irreversible. And the worst part? There was nothing to confront. No person to blame. No statement to refute. Just a system doing what systems do when they decide you're a problem. They remove you quietly. According to insiders, Meghan's reaction to this phase was markedly different. Where Harry internalized the rejection, she questioned it. Why is this happening? Why won't anyone explain? Why are people pretending nothing's wrong? From her perspective, the silence felt manipulative, and that interpretation hardened her stance. The more opaque the process became, the less willing she was to accept it quietly, which, again, clashed with polo culture's core value. Accept quietly. Elite spaces don't respond well to questioning. They respond by closing ranks tighter. And that's exactly what happened. The circle shrank. Information dried up. Harry's presence became an anomaly, something people worked around rather than with. And once that happens, the end is inevitable. Because no one wants to be the last person associated with a perceived problem. So even neutral acquaintances pulled back. Not out of malice. Out of self-preservation. That's how reputational damage spreads in closed systems. Not through gossip. Through avoidance. People stop inviting you because they don't want to be asked why they invited you. They stop returning calls because they don't want to explain their association. And eventually, they stop thinking about you at all. That's the final stage. Normalization. Harry's absence began to feel normal. And when something becomes normal, it's permanent. By the time he stopped attending altogether, no one questioned it. No one reached out. No one asked if everything was okay. The system had already moved on. And that realization is crushing. Because it tells you the relationship meant more to you than it did to them. But here's the thing. This wasn't just about polo. Polo was the first domino. The place where exclusion could happen quietly. Safely. Without scrutiny. But elite circles are interconnected. And once you're marked in one space, the mark travels. Boardrooms hear about it. Charities hear about it. Social hosts hear about it. Not explicitly. Through tone. Through hesitation. Through subtle shifts in how your name lands in conversation. And Harry was about to discover that the silence didn't end at the field. It followed him. Into rooms he didn't even realize were listening. In the next chapter, we're going to trace that ripple effect. How losing polo didn't just cost Harry a sport, it cost him social capital. How exclusion multiplied quietly. And how a single closed gate became a pattern he couldn't escape. Because in elite ecosystems, no exile is ever isolated. Once one door closes, others start locking themselves. What do you do when no one will tell you what you did wrong? That question haunted everything that followed. Because once the exile from polo became undeniable, the story shifted inward. Away from fields and clubs. Away from public smiles and polite distance. And into private spaces where frustration has room to grow. This is where things stopped being strategic and became emotional. According to people familiar with Harry's state of mind during this period, the confusion eventually hardened into something darker. Disbelief. Not outrage. Not rage. Disbelief that a world he believed understood him had turned its back without explanation. At first, Harry reportedly replayed every interaction, every match, every conversation, every moment that could have gone differently. He searched for the missing piece, the mistake that could explain the outcome. But the problem was simple and brutal. There was no single mistake. There was only accumulation. And accumulation doesn't give you closure. It gives you doubt. Doubt about your judgment. Doubt about your instincts. Doubt about whether the rules you thought applied ever did. People close to Harry say this period was marked by oscillation. One day, he was convinced the situation was fixable. That time and distance would cool things down. The next, he was certain the damage was permanent. That contradiction alone is exhausting, because you can't grieve something you're not sure you've lost. So instead of acceptance, Harry stayed in limbo. And limbo breeds frustration. Not the explosive kind, the quiet, corrosive kind. According to insiders, he became increasingly withdrawn in conversations about polo. He stopped talking about matches, stopped sharing plans, stopped bringing it up unless asked. That silence wasn't indifference. It was self-protection, because talking about something you've lost without knowing why only deepens the wound. At the same time, resentment began to surface. Not openly. Internally. Resentment toward a culture,